Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be able to share some of this stuff with you. So let me start with this idea of what programming language is according to ChatGPT. So ChatGPT says a programming language is a means of telling computers what to do. So if you were designing a programming language and you came to your colleagues and you said, I have this programming language, but let me tell you what I've added to it. If a man uses it, it's going to work this way. If a woman uses it, it's going to work this way. It's going to change every 10 years. It's going to be different according to what region of the country you're in. It's going to be different if you're in a good mood or if you're not in a good mood. And that's my programming language. You would say, I think you need to go back to the drawing board. So ideally, a code or a language shouldn't vary and it shouldn't change. So the thing is that the way human language works? Is it a system that doesn't vary? Is it a system that doesn't change? Well, you might say, well, if that was true, we might have some advantage here. We wouldn't have to have translators. Everybody could talk to everybody around the globe. We would have all kinds of regularity in the system. We wouldn't have to worry about old languages and new languages. Everything would just go on as it always has been and as it always will be. And that would be great. But we know that in the real world, that's not what happens. So let's figure out in a second why that is. Let me just say another assumption that I'm going to be operating from, and that's that humans are near the top. Now, I was going to say of the evolutionary ladder, but somebody just sent me an article saying that the ladder continues to go and we don't know where the top is. So we're not at the top of that ladder. Are we at the top of the food chain? Well, somebody else said to me, what about the microbes that can kill you like that? So maybe we're not at the top of the food chain. But I'm going to say we're at the top of the control period in terms of being able to control our environment. We control what we eat, where we live, for the most part, who we hang around with, more than other species on the planet. So are these two things related? Well, one of the things to think about is how we got to that top of the control period. We're not the fastest. We're not the biggest. We're not the strongest. We don't have the sharpest teeth. We're born fairly helpless. So what put us where we are on what I was calling the control period? And I'm going to say it's our social structure. We somehow figured out that if we bond together as humans, we can overcome a lot of these shortcomings and we can kind of get to the point where we can build skyscrapers and cars and all these other kinds of things. And one of the things that linguists will say is the only way that you can get a complex social system like this is to have a communication system like we have. So we can communicate all kinds of things that allow us to have the social structure that we have, and that allows us to sort of flourish in the way that we have sort of flourished. All right. So this communication system is paramount to being able to do this. All right. And one of the things that seems to be inherent in our communication system is this variability. So one way of thinking about it is it reflects the social structure. We have figured out that in order to sort of immediately say where I am in this social world, I can do it by the way I talk. I can slightly change my vowels. I can slightly change the way I'm holding my vocal tract. I can use different intonation patterns. I can use different words. I can use different syntax. And one of the things that results from this is I immediately say, here's who I am in relation to you. Here's who I am in relation to other people. And this is a good thing. This is something that allows us to sort of work together as a community. Now it's got its downfalls, which is we can't turn it off. Sadly for us, we're not able to just say, I'm not going to judge people based on X, Y, and Z. So, you might argue about whether it's more important for us to be bonded together as humans and do all the things that we can do, or is it, does it cause us to be this judgmental? Well, the fact that there has been this language variation probably since the first hominid had a descended larynx and could produce speech says that there's something functional about the variation. It's useful to us. And it keeps on existing. I do want to say that it's extremely systematic. So it's not a random thing. These guys decided to do this and these guys decided to do this. And I'm going to show you my favorite chart here, which shows this. This is from Bill Above, who is kind of the father of sociolinguistics, doing work that he did in Philadelphia. So he was looking at a language change that was spreading through the community. He, like me, was interested in vowels and what was happening with vowels. And what this chart shows is the progression of a vowel from one stage to another. This is showing F2, the second set of formants that get sort of resonated in the vocal tract in the front part of the mouth. And if you move your tongue progressively forward, you shrink that space, which means you create higher and higher frequencies. So this is showing that every 10 years, people are moving their tongue slightly forward, slightly forward, slightly forward, till they get to the point where it's as far forward as it can go. But it's not random. It's happening very systematically. It's saying something about what we know about language subconsciously. People that are sort of driving this change have to know that this is happening, have to know how it's progressing, have to know what they have to do to sort of situate themselves in these different decades. And then we get older people saying ow. What this is ow to ale. So south to south. So now people, this is done quite a while ago, so my guess is that most people in Philadelphia are saying south. And by most people, I mean certain areas and certain social classes and a part of Philadelphia. But this change has moved through Philadelphia in this very systematic way. And this is the way that a lot of vowel changes work. I'm going to say really briefly about different vowel systems in the United States, but they all sort of progress with this regularity, with a few exceptions. But for the most part, this is a relatively common thing that happens. Okay? Now, one of the best examples of this bonding together and using a dialect that some people say is kind of surprising that it still exists is looking at African American English. So African American English is a dialect, as it's going to say on the next slide, spoken by about 40 to 50 million people in the United States. And it's persisted in contact with European Americans for centuries. In other parts of the world where there was a similar social history, you don't get this same thing happening. You don't get African Brazilian Portuguese, for instance. It's only something that happens in the United States. And then the question becomes why? All right. Now, it's interesting because in theory, we've all been living in the same cities. In theory, we've been going to the same schools, same stores, etc. But in actuality, it doesn't really work out this way. This is from the census, the 2020 census, showing New York City, and the blue dots are African American people, the green dots are European American people. And the main thing to get from this is that even though we live in the same city, we're fairly segregated. If you say, well, that's New York, that's not Houston, here's Houston, you can see Houston's a lot more spread out than New York, but you see the same sort of patterns where people are living in very different parts of the city. So even though we all live in this same 600 square mile area, we are living in different parts. We're certainly going to different schools. Nonetheless, we are coming into contact with each other. People are watching relatively similar media. People are engaging with each other. And in a lot of the ways that people think about this dialect, African American English dialect, should have been something that just kind of got absorbed by the European American dialects, but it hasn't. All right? So 40 to 50 million speakers speak some variety of African American English. It differs at every single linguistic level, the morphological level, the syntactic level. I'm just going to show this really quickly. This is just the tip of the iceberg in the differences in syntax that you get with African American versus European American English. It's also different in terms of words that people use and also conversational styles that people engage in. The area that I'm interested in is the phonetics and phonology area. And so that's what we've been mapping in Houston. How are these varieties different in Houston, Texas? All right. Here is what we call a vowel chart in linguistics. You have what corresponds to the front of the vowels, the vocal tract on the top, on the x-axis, and what corresponds to the back chamber on the y-axis. And in a nutshell, we just measure the frequencies that are coming out of people's mouths, and we can say something about how these vowels are patterning in that person's speech. So this is a young European American speaker. All right. There's some really interesting things going on in Houston in the white community. One of the things that's kind of interesting for me is that they're losing a vowel. So I have 13 vowels. Younger speakers in Houston who are European American have only 12. That's because the vowel and on, no, I just did the wrong vowel. On and off have merged in the speech of younger people, and it's still separate in the older people. It's also separate in the African American speakers. So this is the same type of measurement. This is the same vowels. It doesn't matter if you don't really know which are which, but the main thing to see is that the vowels are patterning very differently. So we have this vowel merger here in the European Americans, and we have two separate vowels in the African Americans. We have a really interesting thing. That vowel at the top is U, oo. In the younger speakers in Houston, it comes out U. All right, in the European American community, but not in the African American community. So basically what we have is 11 different vowels that are different, 11 vowels that are different from speakers of European American versus African American in these two communities. So here's all the 30 young speakers that we measured. And the people at this end are using most of the African American vowels. The people at this end are using more European American vowels. And one of the things that happened when we put everybody on this Klein according to the vowel systems they were using is this. All the African Americans were at this side and all the European Americans were at this side, which is pretty amazing because usually you don't get such nice, neat results. But one of the most interesting things is these speakers right here, M, O, C, T, and O, S, all reported that people said that they sounded white. And even though they sort of said, yeah, I get teased all the time because I sound white, they still have some features in African American English. This is just the vowels. This isn't anything to do with the consonants. That's a whole other story. And I'm not touching syntax here. But just at this level of this, the kind of smallest level, how do the sounds get organized? We see huge differences. Okay. Now, are there consequences for speaking a dialect that's non-standard? There certainly are consequences. I'm going to go through these really quickly. But in the education realm, I could have picked any number of things showing how people who speak these dialects are discriminated against. One way I'll show you is this thing called specific language impairment. It's a so-called impairment where somebody has problems with language. It's very hard to define. It just means they have some sort of language problem. They don't seem to have a hearing problem. They don't seem to have a learning disability or anything. They just have a problem with language. Well, it turns out if you look at how these pattern, race gets implicated in this all the time. So does education level, and so does family history. Well, this is exactly how dialects pattern. So what's happening is kids who are sitting in these classes using African American English syntax and morphology are being labeled as speech learning disabled or speech disabled. And so that's a problem. There's all kinds of other things that happen in the education realm. This is just showing you that it turns out mysteriously that by the time kids are 8, they've already lost this impairment, which is just bizarre to think of this as an impairment. And what's happening is the kids are figuring out, I better use this other dialect if I don't want to suffer consequences. So that's what's happening here. All right, you still have consequences in the court. I'm going to go really quickly through this. This is just court reporters totally messing up what African American defendants or witnesses said in the trial. So I have a couple of slides with this, but the main thing to show you is this is 25 different court reporters. This is people getting errors in words. This is people getting errors in the transcription, and this is people getting errors in the meaning of the sentences. So what this is showing is that when people with these dialects show up in court, the court reporters who are charged with saying to the jury, this is what was said in the court case, some of them don't even get 25% accuracy what the defendants are saying. All right. There's also all kinds of other consequences for people who speak these dialects. There's discrimination in housing, employment, and childcare, as John Baugh showed in the 90s. Now he's looking at childcare, but healthcare, but housing and employment was something that he'd been looking at for a while. So the big question then is, why are these varieties used? Why do people continue to use these varieties if there are all these consequences? And the big question is, why indeed? Why would people use them? Well, the main thing is people aren't stupid. People don't do things that don't serve them in some manner. So there has to be a functional reason for these dialects to continue to exist. And in this case, what we have is community. This is people saying, in this community, Houston, Texas, or New York, or wherever we are, my community, part of my identity will be based on race in a way that's different from how this works out in other countries. It says race is something that's kind of important to us here in ways that it isn't in other places. So it's important for people to feel like this is the community I belong to. That community is maybe not accepting me for all kinds of reasons, so it's important that I belong to a community. And one of the ways I'm going to show that I belong to this community is talking a way that identifies me as a member of this community. Okay, this is no different from why we see all these different dialects in Great Britain and all kinds of other places too. It's why dialects exist. People say, this is who I am, this village, this sexuality, this religion, this race, this social class is important to me, it's important to show it, and I'm going to do this by the way that I talk. Now, this stuff is not happening consciously, so people aren't thinking, I'm just going to raise my a little bit so that I sound like a Philadelphian. It's something that happens what we call below the level of consciousness. But the fact that it's happened throughout time tells us that this is an important way that we operate as humans, that we communicate, okay? So let's go back to computers for a second. Is this a problem for computerized speech? Well, we know that it's a huge problem for speech recognition. I can bring up any number of articles that show that you have big problems with dialects in automated speech recognition. This is looking at African American English, and one of the things that you're seeing here is very low, very high word error rates for African American speakers versus European American speakers. And another chart from this article also says over 24% of the speakers that they looked at that were African American had zero recognition of their speech, compared to 1% for European Americans. So this is a huge difference in the way automated speech recognition works. So we might want to take into account this variability in speech recognition. What about production? Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Whose variety do we decide to synthesize? Do you want my Northern Cities Detroit vowels? Do you want African American English vowels being synthesized? Do you want this generation because it's going to change in the next generation? Do you want somebody who's speaking formally or informally? It's really hard to say we're going to put some sort of average, usual, real dialect of American English because it just doesn't exist. So we've sort of decided this is what Siri will sound like, this is what Alexis will sound like, but it doesn't really represent any dialect that's out there. Okay. So one of the reasons for this is that all of this work is being done on what we call impoverished data. Most of the work that's done in ChatGPT and these other sort of large language models are looking at written stuff that's on the internet. They're not getting the kind of lived language that happens when people talk to each other. So we call it impoverished because it's a very limited set of rules with regard to how language operates, all right? And the main thing to take away is if variation doesn't get taken into account, there's no way to get to any sort of human-like recognition, any sort of human-like production. It just won't happen because human languages vary. And if we don't have computers that are varying what they're doing, they might be completely understandable, but they're not going to be human. They're not going to sound human, all right? Can we ever take it into account? Probably not. Because the second we kind of get our eye on what's happening in this community, it's changed. It changes so fast that it would be really hard to say, now we've got it. Now our recognizer can recognize everything because it'll only recognize the old people, not what the young people are doing. All right, but let's say we somehow figure out how to get variation worked in. All right, let's say we figure out how to make a computer recognize and produce speech just like a human. Is this a problem? Will we ever get to this point where it's human? I have some good news. You don't have to be afraid of this happening because there's just no way that it will. One of the things is we are not making the recognizers in computers do what a human recognition system does. Our cochlea is completely attuned to the frequencies that come out of other humans' mouths. Not our predators, not our prey. We can't sense vibrations in the ground. We can't do the things that other animals do. We can understand other humans. And we're not creating computer systems that understand other computer systems. We're creating computers that understand our speech. So that's the first problem. All right. The other thing is, why do languages vary? So hopefully I made the point that languages are varying because of the work that it does for us. It builds up a sense of community. It gives us a chance to kind of work together and overcome these other things like running slow and other sorts of things like that. Can we get a computer to do this? Is there a way to make a computer somehow feel simpatico with other computers? You know, in terms of saying, I'm bonded with these other computers. I'm bonded with the ones that have black on the outside and not silver. The ones that have silver, those aren't very good. We're not going to build computers that identify with other computers. And that seems to be a crucial part of where human-like language comes from. All right? We're not going to be able to imitate what's happening with our social structure in the computer world because, for one thing, it's extremely complex. We don't know all the ins and outs. We don't know it well enough to be able to get a computer to be able to do this. All right? Now, anybody who have ever had me in class knows I'm not afraid of computers. I'm terrified of birds because birds have this social structure. There are birds who, I've seen a video where there was food under a board and two birds sort of sat on the end and lifted up the board so the birds could eat. And when they had finished eating, two birds hopped around and tipped it back up so the two that were holding the board up could eat. This is amazing. Birds have the ability to produce the same sounds that humans have for the most part and more. And birds have this social structure, so we should be a little afraid of birds. And birds have dialects. Birds, if you take a bird from one part of the country and raise it in another part, the songs will be completely different. So if the aerodynamics change and they can have bigger brains and still be able to fly, we're all in trouble. All right. Now here is a chat GPT thing where the guy said, I'm having a problem. The human said, I don't like what you're doing, Bing, and I'm going to go to Google, and you see that Bing's feelings were very hurt. So the computer says, oh no, don't do that. But is this really Bing doing this? Is this the computer doing this, or is this something that the smart alecky computer programmers put in there? And my guess is it's not something that Bing is really worried about. So there's no evidence that we're programming any of these systems to mirror anything like the human social structure. So we don't have to worry about any of these messy social structures showing up in the computerized world. So in the face of machine takeovers, it's our social structure, our messy social structure that's going to lead to our resilience against the machines, just like it leads to the resilience of African American English in response to the strong sort of forces against it. Okay, that was a very fast version. All right. Thanks very much. I guess I'm... I have a thank you.
Thanks. So first, I just have to say, very cool, Nancy. I'm going to sit here and try not to analyze my own language as I talk to you guys. But thank you for giving up some of your Tuesday and coming to listen to us. I'm going to continue some of the theme of social structure in my talk, but shift a little bit from linguistics resilience to more climactic or disaster resilience. And the main argument I want to make is that as good as we can do in this engineering building and elsewhere with new built infrastructures and green infrastructures, that's going to be insufficient. That to really be truly resilient as we go forward, we're going to need resilience in the social structure, in the social sphere, and that social inequalities are analogous to cracks in that infrastructure. And so part of the job of social scientists is to reveal those cracks and to use our tools in some respects to render the invisible visible en route to a more transformative and I think meaningful form of resilience. So that's going to be sort of my major argument or point for the next 15, 20 minutes. And to put this in context, you'd have to be somewhat different not to realize that almost every time we open the news or some web browser, we're getting inundated with more and more news and more events that would be classified maybe as weather-related or climate-related disasters. Whether it's fires, floods, storms, we now even have hurricanes off the Pacific coast of the US in ways that we hadn't before. And so in thinking about these dimensions, what we see here is a graph over time, the last 50 years or so, 70 years, of disaster declaration. So these are events that rose to the level of requiring a federal declaration of disaster to help local and state jurisdictions keep from being overwhelmed. So being overwhelmed is the new abnormal in a sense. And so the point here, and you've probably seen graphs like this before, the new abnormal isn't another steady state. It's not that we're moving up there to a different sort of situation and then going to adjust to that. It is a trajectory. It is on the move. And so what we are faced with in this sort of situation is thinking about how we're going to adjust or become resilient. There's lots of social science out there. It's beginning to shift on this. But if you dial into any one of these events on here, what you often find that there are sort of phases, or we can think about that event or disaster sort of unfolding in phases. The first is sort of an immediate sort of short-term response period that I'll talk a little bit more about. And that's actually, research shows there's some good news there. That oftentimes what happens is people bond together and help one another. Think the Cajun Navy coming to rescue folks, or people helping one another across daily social divides. Social scientists oftentimes call this the period of therapeutic community. It sort of bonds and we come together. Then intermediate, oftentimes that begins to fade, the reporters leave, and we enter into this phase of maybe more conspicuous resilience, where we have #strong and we have t-shirts and we have politicians saying we're going to rebuild better than ever. And then we get into the longer term recovery, which starts to sort of play out over longer and longer periods. So this is where we are, and we're getting more and more of these events. And as you think about that, it's probably not surprising that this notion of resilience begins to come to the fore. So I don't know how many of you played around with n-grams before. I had an undergrad show me this. He's like, oh, this seems pretty cool. You can go in and put in some words up there. So I picked 3 hot environmental words: sustainability, resilience, and mitigation. And you can pick which language. I picked American English. And you can look at the frequency of appearance in that language in books over time. So what we can see here is that in the early 1970s here, sort of first Earth Day, people are starting to get serious and concerned about environmental problems on a pretty big scale. We have the rise of mitigation, which in short is the idea that we're going to reduce impacts on the planet. Then over time, that sort of takes off, but then around the early 1990s, we have this sort of emergence of the concept of sustainability. Maybe not just reducing our impacts on the planet, but developing new mixes of innovations and technologies and incentives where we can get back into equilibrium. We can get this world back into a sort of more normal period. And that's still ongoing, but here we have this rapid and rhetorical rise of resilience more recently, where if you trend this out, it's becoming the dominant sort of concept that people are sort of putting out there in this climate disaster space. So I'm always suspicious when things take off like that. I don't know about you, maybe it's just me. But one of the things that resilience does, I think, is it puts forward a promise of not just surviving, but thriving forward in this new abnormal. But it can also do that in a way that maybe hides as much as it reveals. And so what I want to do is share some research, some homegrown research from the Rice Social Sciences that begins to peel back some of this with respect to some of the most important resilience programs, although they haven't always been called that, that we have through our federal government. So before I get there, we can think of each disaster people. Think about Harvey, think about Katrina, other events. Oftentimes this is sort of the timeline that that FEMA will use, but it's also one that international agencies will use to think about what happens. So they typically say, okay, there's a short-term sort of trigger and response where there's immediate need for survival and help. Then it sort of stretches out into intermediate phase of weeks and months where people are beginning to put things back together. And then we get into the long term. And now we're beginning to realize that that long term probably is now looping back into the state of preparedness. How do we become resilient by not just recovering, but building preparedness into that recovery? So again, lots of interesting things happen in these different components. Lots of interesting social dynamics, emergent properties, emergent behaviors. What I want to do again is think about how we can think about and reveal some of the resilience programming that's happening behind the rhetoric. So with that, we can focus on FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And if you look at FEMA, maybe some of you have experienced some of these stages, but you can break FEMA's programs up into sort of three major types of components. There's the initial FEMA individual assistance programs, which all of us pay taxpayer money into. This is not based on property tax. It's based on federal income tax. And these funds go to basically get people back up and running. So it's immediate response to households and individuals when a disaster hits. Then what happens is we begin to move into the FEMA public assistance programs. These actually, for context, in terms of dollars, are about 8 to 10-fold what the investments are in initial recovery. This is when you begin to rebuild infrastructure, schools, et cetera, in the area. And then increasingly we now have FEMA mitigation or buyout programs, where the idea is to begin removing people from the riskiest areas so that we can be resilient by sort of subtraction, get people out of those zones instead of having to face it over and over. So what I want to do is use this as a bit of a roadmap to showcase some research that folks have done here, or at least started here in these areas. Again, the idea is sort of using social science to render the invisible visible so that we can see what's happening with these resilience programs behind the rhetoric. So we'll start with this guy. This guy is Ethan Raker. I don't know, maybe if you were around 2015, 2016, you might have run across him on campus. He was a postbac. He came to Rice. He wanted to work in sociology, get some skills, work with the Kinder Institute, and then apply to grad school. So we got to know each other. He'd done his thesis, undergrad style, up at Columbia and was really interested in New Orleans and Katrina and what happened there. So we talked, we did some research, and I take some pride. I think I planted the seeds for him to go on to grad school. So he went on to grad school to Harvard. I extended sort of my mentorship as an external member of his committee there, and he got interested in these dynamics going forward. He's now an assistant professor at University of British Columbia. So why do I show you this? Okay, so this is the first phase. What happens? Why is social inequality important for resilience, and why is it important to get the data to look at this? So this is going to be a busy slide. I'm going to try to condense a lot of effort into one slide. But here's what Ethan did. He goes, you know what? I want to see what actually happens as people apply into this program. And I don't want to do it from a case study perspective and go and study individuals. That's important, but I want to see the big picture. I want to go out and get data and see what happens as people move through these different sort of stages of the application process to see if there are inequities. Turns out there are no publicly available data. It's hidden. But Ethan, being from Rice, was undaunted. And so he filed a FOIA request and said, give me the data. He got the data. And he got a lot of data. He got nearly 5.5 million records of people who had applied for this program over about an 11, 12-year period. So what he did is he looked through the applications, and you can see how people get in. How many people apply? How many then sort of move through the application process, get inspected, and then get appraised so they're eligible to receive money, and then how much money do they get and to what end. So this is what Ethan found as he went through this, and it was just published earlier this year in the journal Social Forces. So, what he found, lots of stuff behind this, but historical inequities, unsurprisingly, have put lower income and communities of color into harm's way at higher proportion, right? They are the places where the flood is most likely to happen. They are in housing structures, these communities oftentimes, that are not particularly well constructed. They're older, etc. And so there's higher exposure in this part of the social structure. So that means that folks from these communities are more likely to apply for FEMA assistance. Makes sense. More exposed, more application. But what happens then is a winnowing. What happens is FEMA inspectors have to come in, assess the property, and make judgments, and in the process, ask for proof of ownership of the property, document that any damage that's being reported actually came from the storm. There's a lot of scrutiny, a lot of concern with fraud. And what that thing does is basically begins to kick people out of this system. And so more exposed, but begin to drop out of the application or be denied at higher rates. Even if folks from these communities make it through at a lower proportion of success, they tend to get less money from the program. And that money typically goes towards rent. That is paying a landlord for the shelter, not for rebuilding their housing assets. So this creates a double inequity. More exposure, less assistance through bureaucratic processes that begin to winnow and to attract people out of the system and eligibility. Okay, public assistance, that's the next phase. This is the sort of intermediate to getting longer intermediate phase. This is Junia Howe. She is one of the very first Rice sociology PhDs. We had our first PhDs come through the program in 2017. She was one of them. So we worked together and we looked at some of the FEMA public assistance. Again, the goal was to render the invisible visible so we could look at things. What we wanted to look at in this particular study was how it was that wealth might become increasingly divided or polarized, or wealth trajectories over time as local areas experience climate events or disasters. Wealth being a serious indicator of overall resilience at the household and family level. So what did we do? We couldn't get data that was immediately relevant, so we had to go out and get restricted access data. So we had to petition for that. We got gold standard data that followed people for years, asking them about their wealth, where they lived, and all sorts of other covariates that we could use in our statistical models. What we were interested in was what happens over time as people are exposed to increasing levels of hazard damage or disaster damage in their local area, specifically their county. So, lots of stuff going on behind this. I've taken sort of two demographic types just to sort of give an illustration. This is me when I lived in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit. I was a white college homeowner working at Tulane, and across the street my neighbor Crip was black, high school grad, and a renter. So I use those for illustration purposes. But here's what we have. If we put everything equal, which it never was, after about 15 years, if we started with the same starting wealth at the beginning of this study period, after about 14 years, I would have, on average, the expectation of about $60,000 more of wealth than Crip, just due to sort of the social equities tied to homeownership, race, and education. All of us. So that's a gap that we would expect. What we found is, okay, let's put people into counties of increasing hazard damage over this period. What we found is that the more damage an area sort of experienced, the wider this wealth gap got. This is not good news in the age of intensifying disasters. Not only that, we parse it again, and these differences were true within groups. So you could take just white folks, homeowner versus renter, same sort of thought. Black high school grad versus college grad, same thought. But what struck us is when we modeled additional data about how much public assistance money came in from FEMA to an area to help it rebuild and become resilient, the more this divided. it didn't come together, raising the question, of course, resilience for whom? Looks like it's resilience for some, but not all. Okay. Now to the housing mitigation, otherwise known as the home buyout. I don't know how many of you know this, but it is a extended policy, not just in the US, but around the world. The idea is to increase resilience by subtraction. Subtract houses and people out of the areas where it's going to be most risky now and in the future. So there are funds set aside to buy people out of these areas nationwide at a fair market value. So this is going on in more than 500 city towns across the US in every state. And it's growing. There's more and more money being put into this, not just the US ministry. So Jay White, current spatial analyst at the Kindred Institute. So we're working together on an NSF-funded project to think about what these dynamics are going to do in terms of social structure. So, rendering the invisible visible. First of all, we're like, hey, wouldn't it be nice to have data on everybody who took one of these federally funded buyouts across the nation as a whole? Thankfully, we can do that. Why? Because about 5 or 6 years ago, the National Public Radio sued the federal government to get the data. FEMA said, no, this is privacy. You cannot reveal people's expenditures and the selling of their homes in this program. They went back and forth in the courts, and eventually the courts said, you know what? It's in the public interest. You need to release these data. So there are now data on where people have sold their home through this program, and that's enough for a lot of federal assistance assessments. FEMA just cares about where the house was sold and how much money it's going to save in the National Flood Insurance Program as a result. I don't know how many of you know this, the National Flood Insurance Program is currently $20 billion in debt and in crisis mode. It's restructuring, but this is a Hail Mary to get folks out of that program to keep the program alive, in addition to raising rates. So what we did is we took those data that are now rendered visible through these FOIA requests, and we mapped them. And so over here is everywhere where we could find homeowners who took a buyout. So the smaller the dot, the fewer, the larger the dot. So we have quite a few in Houston. Houston, in many respects, is actually the buyout capital. It's not the only place, but. So what do? We then use those data with new techniques to match each individual to consumer reference files that we could then follow them over time to see where people actually move. And then we attach risk ratings on their flood scores at their origin house to their destination house. What did we find? Several things. One, 80 to 85% of all these expenditures and transactions are happening in majority white neighborhoods. We also find that when people move, they stay really close. Here's an example from Houston. This is a 5-mile ring and a 10-mile ring, where we map people moving out from a given neighborhood. So, white communities living fairly close, and something that surprises them, people are reducing their flood risk. When they engage in this, they buy a new home and move, they reduce their flood risk on average 65% across the country. But they do it by moving to another white neighborhood. So by and large, we have a mitigation funding structure right now that's retreating white communities to nearby spaces in their respective communities and around the communities. So that's where we are. So back to the big picture. Resilience is about bouncing forward and moving forward, but it seems like behind the scenes, after the rhetoric or behind the rhetoric and the rise of resilience, we also have these resilience programs that are bringing people down in some respects, or not providing the same service. Those are cracks in the social infrastructure. Those need attention as much as new dams and bridges. So my colleagues often call me Dr. Buzzkill. And I know I do group hugs in class. I mean, we do get through. But
Did someone say ooh?
but okay, there is some good news. So what can we do? Is there room for optimism? And I say yes, cautiously so. Here are a couple examples. So action and impact. Here's where Rice is doing good work, I think. So shortly after the wealth study that I showed you in brief, Elizabeth Warren, who was the head of the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate, and Benny Thompson, same in the House, they got together and cited our research and said, hey, we need more investigation through the Government Accountability Office. Let's get on this. Equity seems to be an issue. Let's get to it. That then moved forward. Then the FEMA National Advisory Council says, you know what? They're right. We need to begin to build new blueprints that focus on equity. Not say it's something out there not related to resilience, but something we have to, in fact, take into account, not just in terms of measuring the need for assistance, but the outcome of what we do when we give assistance. So that's ongoing. This is the budget report. Each year the president puts out the annual budget. So earlier this year, Biden actually put out his budget plan, and in his section on adaptation of policy and planning, he cites our work and related research to say, you know, we need to move forward. So moving in the right direction, optimistically, but we need to still pay attention. Second of three, out of that National Advisory Council discussion and that commitment, FEMA actually now has a series of annual civil rights summits where they take into consideration civil rights as a resilience and climate dimension. So the next one is in November, Advancing Environmental Justice. So I'll be a speaker at that, aiming at FEMA, and we'll see what they have to say. It's mainly FEMA folks sort of answering and going through thinking about new programs. Finally, anybody heard about these new community disaster resilience zones? They just came out a couple weeks ago. Pretty cool, I think. I'm optimistic. I'm not going to be Dr. Buzzkill forever. This is a federal initiative that says, hey, we need to put money where our mouth is. So what we're going to do is, in advance of a storm, not wait till it happens, we're going to identify areas with high environmental risk, like flooding, and link that to areas of high social disadvantage. And if you meet those criteria, we are going to funnel money into your community over the next 5 years to see how we can make you more resilient in advance of the storm and rectify some of these issues. So, what's interesting is they were released across the country. The county with the most of these new disaster resilience zones, Harris County. So we have a real opportunity to lead and learn in this